I'm Clara, 32 female. I live in a house that breathes history, a place where the scent of old wood and lemon oil is as familiar to me as my own reflection. For the last 10 years, I've been the unofficial custodian of my family's ancestral home on Hemlock Lane, a duty I took on not out of obligation, but out of a deep and abiding love for the structure itself. My work as an architectural historian feels less like a job and more like a calling, one that my father, Arthur, a man who measures life in stock tickers and quarterly reports, has always dismissed as a quaint but profitless hobby. My younger brother, Leo, the golden child and a cutthroat financial broker, has always mirrored my father's opinion, viewing my life's work with a kind of amused condescension. I always knew my father valued my brother's paycheck more than my passion, but I never imagined he'd use the very foundation of our family home, the literal floorboards beneath my feet, to prove it. The eviction notice wasn't just a legal document. It was a final judgment on my worth in his eyes, a cold declaration that my contribution to our family legacy was worth less than nothing. But as they would soon discover, my unique understanding of that legacy, of every nail, beam, and secret held within those walls, was a form of power they had never bothered to comprehend. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The house on Hemlock Lane wasn't just a structure of wood and brick. It was a living chronicle of my family's past, and I was its devoted scribe. My great-grandfather, a man with a penchant for meticulous craftsmanship and an obsession with longevity, had built it in 1922. He used heartwood from old-growth chestnut trees, a species that would be all but wiped out by blight just a few decades later. He'd laid the foundation with stone quarried from the local riverbed and insisted on copper flashing for the roof, ensuring it would outlast him and generations to come. I knew this not just from family lore, but from the blueprints I had carefully restored and the journals I had spent countless hours deciphering. To me, the house was a priceless artifact. To my father and brother, it was simply an asset, its value listed on a spreadsheet, fluctuating with the whims of the real estate market. For the past decade, since my grandmother passed, I had been its sole resident. The arrangement was informal, a classic family understanding that was never put in writing. I would live there, pay the utilities, and handle the endless, costly upkeep that a century-old house demanded. In return, I had a home. My salary as an architectural historian wasn't extravagant, but I poured most of it back into the property. I'd spent a small fortune having the original slate roof painstakingly repaired, tile by tile. I'd sourced historically accurate paint for the exterior trim and spent an entire summer stripping and refinishing the intricate woodwork in the main hall that my grandmother had allowed a tenant to cover with thick, white gloss paint in the 70s. My father saw these as expenses. I saw them as investments in our heritage. The difference in our perspectives was a chasm that had been widening for years. I remember one Sunday dinner, just a few months before everything imploded. We were gathered around the massive oak dining table that my great-grandfather had built with his own hands. Leo was boasting about a multi-million-dollar deal he had just closed. He spoke in a language of derivatives, mergers, and aggressive acquisitions that was completely foreign to me. My father listened with rapt attention, his chest puffed out with pride. "That's my boy," Arthur had boomed, clapping Leo on the back, "building a real empire, making his mark on the world." He then turned to me, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "And Clara, how are your old houses coming along? Find any interesting dust bunnies lately?" Leo snickered into his wine glass. I felt the familiar sting of casual dismissal, a sensation I had grown accustomed to but never immune to. I had just had a research paper published in a prestigious historical journal, a detailed analysis of pre-war construction techniques that had taken me 2 years to complete. It was, in my world, a significant achievement. "Actually," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "my paper on the structural integrity of American chestnut timber framing was accepted by the Preservation Quarterly." It's being published next month. My father waved a dismissive hand. That's nice, dear. I'm sure your colleagues will be very impressed. He then turned back to Leo, the conversation immediately shifting back to market trends and capital gains. I was once again invisible, my accomplishments rendered trivial, a footnote in the grand narrative of my brother's financial success. It was in these small, repeated moments that the foundation of our family had been eroding, long before the legal papers were ever drawn up. I often walked the halls at night, running my hand along the cool plaster walls, feeling the subtle imperfections that told a story. I knew the spot on the third step of the main staircase that always creaked, the result of a support joist that had settled unevenly in 1934. I knew the faint etching on a window pane in the library, where my grandmother, as a young girl, had practiced her initials with her mother's diamond ring. These were the details that gave the house its soul. My brother saw the large yard and thought of its potential for subdivision. My father saw the prime location and calculated its resale value. They saw a shell, a container for wealth. I saw the heart of our family, and I was desperately trying to keep it beating. This devotion was what blinded me to the reality of my situation. I believed that my care, my dedication, and my deep, tangible connection to our family's history would count for something. I assumed it had earned me a place, a permanent foothold in the one spot on earth I considered home. I paid the bills, I fixed the leaks, I guarded the memories. I was the keeper of the flame, and I never once imagined that the people who shared my bloodline were planning to douse it in cold water, simply because the land it stood on had become too valuable to be occupied by someone who couldn't leverage it for more. The house on Hemlock Lane was my sanctuary, my life's work, and my home. And I was about to learn that in my father's world, none of that mattered. The day my world tilted on its axis began with the deceptive calm of a Tuesday morning. I was in the study, hunched over a light table, carefully examining a fragile map of the township from 1890, when the sound of a car crunching on the gravel driveway broke my concentration. I wasn't expecting anyone. A glance out the window revealed my father's sleek, black sedan, a vessel of corporate authority that always looked out of place, parked next to my sensible, mud-splattered station wagon. A moment later, my brother Leo's ostentatious sports car pulled in behind it. An impromptu family meeting was rare, and two expensive cars arriving in tandem on a weekday felt less like a social call and more like an invasion. A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I opened the front door before they had a chance to ring the bell. My father, Arthur, stood on the porch, dressed in a sharply pressed suit, his face a mask of stern resolution. Leo stood slightly behind him, rocking on his heels with an air of smug impatience, avoiding my eyes. "Clara," my father said, his tone devoid of any warmth. It was the voice he used for hostile negotiations, not for speaking to his daughter. "We need to talk." He brushed past me into the foyer, his expensive leather shoes echoing on the heart pine floors I had so lovingly restored. Leo followed, a sleek briefcase clutched in his hand. They didn't move towards the living room, the comfortable space for family chats. Instead, my father marched directly to the dining room and stood at the head of the great oak table, as if he were chairing a boardroom meeting. I remained standing, my arms crossed, the sense of dread now a cold certainty in my gut. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice betraying a slight tremble. My father didn't answer immediately. He waited for Leo to place the briefcase on the table and click it open. Arthur reached inside and pulled out a sheaf of papers, which he held for a moment before placing them on the polished wood with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to suck all the air out of the room. "This," my father said, his eyes finally meeting mine, cold and unflinching, "is an eviction notice. And this," he added, tapping a second, thicker document, "is the deed to this house. It has been legally transferred to your brother's name." I stared at the papers, the stark black text blurring before my eyes. Eviction. The word was an absurdity, a cruel joke. This was my home. I looked from the papers to my father's face, searching for some sign that this was a misguided, heavy-handed attempt to scare me, to force me into a different career path. I found nothing but cold, hard conviction. "You're kicking me out," I whispered, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on my tongue. "It's not personal, Clara, it's business," he said, a line he'd used 1,000 times to justify ruthless decisions. "This house is a multi-million-dollar asset. It needs to be managed by someone who understands its value. Leo has a plan for it. You've been treating it like a museum." "It is a museum," I shot back, my voice gaining a fragile strength. "It's our family's history. Grandma wanted me to look after it." Leo scoffed from the sidelines. "Grandma's been gone for 10 years, Clara. Things change, the market changes, Dad. And I have decided that the property's potential needs to be unlocked. It's going to be used as collateral for a new investment fund I'm launching." He said it with such casual arrogance, as if he were discussing a portfolio adjustment and not the dismantling of my entire life. The house wasn't going to be a home, it was going to be leverage, a chip in one of his high-stakes financial games. My father then delivered the final, crushing blow. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his voice dropping to a low, dismissive tone that cut me deeper than any shout could have. "You're a failure, Clara. You're 32 years old, playing with dusty old books in a house you can't afford. You don't contribute. You've been living here for free, a drain on a valuable resource. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet and faced the real world." He tapped the eviction notice. "You have 12 hours to get out. Your brother owns this house now." The silence that followed was immense. In that moment, everything crystallized. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was a verdict. I had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. My life, my choices, my passion, all of it was worthless in their eyes. The pain was sharp and blinding, a physical ache in my chest. I felt the hot sting of tears welling up, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Somehow, from a deep, untapped reservoir of defiance, I found a strange, chilling calm. I looked at my father, the man who was supposed to protect me. I looked at my brother, the boy I had once built forts within the very rooms he was now claiming. I saw them not as family, but as adversaries. And in that cold, clear realization, something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, a raw wound, but it was now overlaid with a layer of ice. I straightened my back. I let a small, unreadable smile touch my lips. The expression seemed to confuse them. They had expected tears, pleading anger. They were prepared for a scene. They were not prepared for my quiet acquiescence. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. My father blinked. "Okay." "Yes," I said, nodding slowly. 12 hours, I understand." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply turned, walked out of the dining room, and went upstairs to my bedroom, leaving them standing in stunned silence beside the weapon they had just deployed. As I began to pull a suitcase from the top of my closet, I wasn't just packing clothes. My mind was already racing, sifting through a decade of knowledge I had accumulated about this house. They thought they were taking away my home. They had no idea they had just handed me the key to their undoing. I smiled again, this time to myself, and I left. The first few hours after leaving Hemlock Lane were a blur of motion and suppressed emotion. I drove to my best friend Isabel's apartment, my car loaded with a haphazard collection of my life's essentials. 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of personal files, my laptop, and most importantly, 3 large archival containers filled with the historical documents I had spent years collecting and preserving. These were the items I grabbed first, an instinct I wouldn't fully understand until later that night. Isabel, a real estate lawyer with a mind as sharp as a razor, took one look at my face, cleared her guest room, and poured me a glass of whiskey without a single question. It was only when I was sitting on the spare bed, surrounded by the sudden, brutal evidence of my displacement, that the shock began to wear off, replaced by waves of grief and fury. I replayed the scene in the dining room over and over. My father's words, "You're a failure," echoed in my head, each repetition a fresh stab. He hadn't just evicted me from a building, he had excommunicated me from the family, casting me out as unworthy. Leo's smug silence was just as damning. He had stood by and watched it happen, the gleam of profit in his eyes outweighing any shred of familial loyalty. Isabel listened patiently as I recounted the entire, ugly affair. She was quiet for a long time, her legal mind processing the injustice. "From a purely legal standpoint, Clara," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "if your father's name was the only one on the deed and there was no written lease agreement, what he did was technically legal. Unethical, monstrous, but legal." Her words should have been discouraging, but they had the opposite effect. The cold legality of it all was what sparked something in me. My father and brother had operated within the black and white confines of modern law. They had their deeds, their transfers, their notices. But the house on Hemlock Lane was a century old. Its history was written in different kinds of ink, governed by older ideas of legacy and stewardship. And my expertise wasn't in modern law, it was in the past. "They think in terms of contracts and loopholes," I said, more to myself than to Isabel. "But this house, has its own rules." Fueled by a new sense of purpose, I carefully opened one of the archival boxes. The scent of old paper and leather filled the small room. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first. I was simply seeking comfort in the familiar, running my fingers over my great-grandfather's elegant script in his journals, studying the delicate lines of the original blueprints. I laid them out on the floor, creating a mosaic of the house's history. And then, my eyes landed on a worn, leather-bound folio I had always assumed contained duplicate architectural drawings. I had cataloged it years ago, but had never scrutinized its contents beyond a cursory glance. My hands trembled slightly as I untied the fraying ribbon. Inside, nestled between sheets of vellum, was not a blueprint, but a thick, folded document, yellowed with age. The heading was written in ornate, slightly faded calligraphy: "Covenant of Preservation and Lineage for the Hemlock Lane Estate." My heart began to pound. A covenant. This was a private, legally binding agreement that could be attached to a property's deed, restricting its use. They were rare, especially ones this old, but they could be incredibly powerful if they were properly executed. I carefully unfolded the document. The language was archaic, full of the flowery, formal prose of the 1920s, but its intent was crystal clear. My great-grandfather, a man who cherished his creation and was deeply skeptical of the fleeting whims of future generations, had laid out a set of rigid conditions for the house. He wrote of his desire for the home to be a perpetual beacon of quality craftsmanship and a steadfast anchor for the family line. I scanned the dense paragraphs, my eyes searching for the operative clauses, and then I found it. Article IV, Section 2, my breath caught in my throat. The clause stated that the ownership of the Hemlock Lane estate could only be transferred to a direct bloodline descendant. That part, my father had technically adhered to by transferring it to Leo. But there was a subclause, a crucial, devastating addition. It stipulated that should the property ever be used primarily as a vehicle for commercial speculation, financial leverage, or any purpose that overtly disregards its inherent historical and familial significance, any other direct descendant with demonstrable expertise and a proven commitment to the principles of historical preservation would have the right to challenge the transfer and claim primary stewardship. The covenant was designed to protect the house not just from outsiders, but from greedy heirs within the family itself. It was a legal time bomb, a clause written in dust, waiting for a century to be discovered. My great-grandfather had, in essence, written me into the house's very foundation. He had created a guardian clause, ensuring that someone who understood and valued the house's soul would have the ultimate power to protect it. My entire career, my hobby, the very thing my father had declared a failure, was the key. My publications, my professional memberships, my years of meticulous restoration work, it was all evidence. I was the descendant with demonstrable expertise. Leo, who planned to use the house as a bargaining chip for his investment fund, was the very definition of a commercially motivated owner, one who was overtly disregarding its significance. "Isabel," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of shock and elation, "I think you need to see this." She came over and knelt on the floor beside me, reading the clause over my shoulder. Her eyes, trained to find any flaw, scanned the document, noting the notarized seal, the signatures, the date. A slow smile spread across her face. "Clara," she breathed, looking up at me, "this is beautiful. This is a work of art." She paused, her smile turning predatory. "And if this was properly filed with the original deed 100 years ago and never legally dissolved, then your father and brother have just made the biggest mistake of their lives." The discovery of the covenant was like finding a map to a hidden arsenal. It was a powerful weapon, but Isabel and I both knew that its effectiveness depended entirely on whether it was legally sound and enforceable in the 21st century. The next few days were a blur of intense, focused activity. Isabel's apartment became our war room, the floor covered in a sea of historical documents and legal textbooks. We operated on caffeine and adrenaline, driven by a shared sense of righteous purpose. Our first step was to determine if the covenant had been properly recorded. An old, private family document was one thing, a legally binding restriction on a property title was another. This was where my skills came into play. I knew from my research that property records from the 1920s were often inconsistent, with many counties in the process of transitioning from archaic, descriptive deeds to more modern block and lot systems. It was easy for things to get lost in the shuffle. I started at the county clerk's office, in a dusty, dimly lit basement room that housed the archives. The digital records only went back to the 1960s. To find what I was looking for, I had to manually comb through enormous, heavy ledger books, their pages brittle and smelling of time. I spent hours deciphering the elegant, looping cursive of long-dead clerks, tracing the history of the parcel of land on Hemlock Lane. I felt a thrill of discovery, the same one I got when I uncovered the hidden history of a building. This time, it wasn't academic, it was personal. After 2 days of painstaking research, I found it. Tucked away in a massive 1922 ledger, cross-referenced to the original deed for my great-grandfather's property, was a clear entry. See Recorded Covenant of Preservation and Lineage, Volume 34, page 112. It was there. It was real. It had been officially filed with the county and attached to the title from the very beginning. I immediately called Isabel, my voice buzzing with excitement. "We've got it. It's on the books. It's been there the whole time." "Fantastic," she said, a new energy in her voice. "That's the anchor we need. Now we have to prove TW. Things that it was never dissolved, and that Leo's ownership directly violates its terms." The first part was a matter of meticulous legal legwork. Isabel took the lead, performing a comprehensive title search, tracing every transaction related to the house for the past century. The history was simple. The property had passed from my great-grandfather to my grandmother and then to my father. Because it had always been a direct family transfer, an inheritance or a gift, the covenant's restrictive clauses were never triggered. No one ever had a reason to challenge it or even look for it. It had lain dormant, a sleeping giant in the county records for 100 years. No judge had ever dissolved it. No agreement had ever been filed to nullify it. It was still very much alive. The second part was proving Leo's intent. This required a different kind of investigation. My brother was smart and secretive about his business dealings, but he was also arrogant. I started with a simple search of his name and his new investment company online. His digital footprint was all about projecting an image of aggressive, high-risk, high-reward success. I found articles in financial blogs where he was quoted, boasting about his strategy of leveraging static assets to create fluid capital. The real breakthrough, however, came from a less conventional source. I remembered Leo mentioning his company was trying to attract a new round of investors. Isabel suggested we see if we could find the prospectus for his new fund. We hired a private financial investigator, a discreet professional Isabel had worked with before. Within 48 hours, he delivered. He had obtained a copy of the confidential investment summary Leo was circulating to potential high-net-worth clients. And there it was, in black and white, on page 5, under the heading Primary Seed Capitalization. The document explicitly listed the Hemlock Lane estate, a residential property with an appraised value of $4.2 million, as the primary collateral for the fund's initial round of financing. It even included a projected timeline for securing a line of credit against the property. It was the smoking gun. Leo's own words, written in a legally binding investment proposal, confirmed that his sole purpose for acquiring the house was for commercial speculation and financial leverage. He hadn't just violated the spirit of the covenant, he had provided us with a signed confession. Back in Isabel's apartment, we laid out all our evidence. The certified copy of the covenant, the century-old ledger entry, Isabel's clean title search showing the covenant had never been removed, and the prospectus for Leo's investment fund. It was a perfect, unbroken chain of evidence connecting the deeds and decades. "They won't see this coming," Isabel said, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "They're operating in their world of modern corporate law. They're about to get blindsided by history." She explained our legal strategy. We could file a lawsuit, which would be long, messy, and public, or we could opt for a more elegant, more devastating approach. "We don't need to declare war just yet," she said. "First, we'll lay a siege. We're going to file for an emergency injunction and place a lease pendens on the property." A lease pendens, she explained, was a public notice that the property's title was subject to a pending lawsuit. It wouldn't evict Leo, but it would instantly make the house a toxic asset. No bank would lend money against it. No one would buy it. It would effectively freeze the property, trapping Leo and my father in a legal quagmire. The $4.2 million asset they had stolen from me would become a worthless weight around their necks. The plan was set. We weren't just fighting an eviction anymore. We were enforcing a legacy. And for the first time since my father had slammed those papers on the table, I felt a sense of power. It wasn't the kind of power that came from money, the only kind my father and brother understood. It was the power of knowledge, of history, and of knowing that the very foundation they stood upon was about to crumble beneath them. The strategy Isabel devised was one of surgical precision, designed to inflict maximum legal and financial damage with minimal noise. A dramatic courtroom confrontation would have been satisfying in a theatrical sense, but Isabel argued that silence was a much more potent weapon. "They expect you to be emotional," she'd said, pacing her living room. "They expect a frantic, messy lawsuit. We're going to give them a cold, quiet, administrative nightmare. They won't even know what hit them until it's too late." The plan had two phases. The first was filing the legal documents. The second, and in many ways the most personally difficult, was my final act of compliance with their eviction order. Isabel spent a day drafting the paperwork for the emergency injunction and the notice of lease pendens. Her reedy NG was a masterpiece of legal prose, weaving together the historical context of the covenant, the concrete evidence of its recording, and the damning proof from Leo's investment prospectus. She cited obscure but solid legal precedents regarding ancestral covenants and property rights. The entire petition was built on the foundation of my work, referencing my professional credentials and my long-standing role as the home's de facto curator to establish me as the rightful steward described in my great-grandfather's document. The package was ironclad. On the morning of my final day, just hours before my 12-hour deadline expired, Isabel electronically filed the documents with the county court and the recorder's office. The digital timestamp was 9:15 a.m. With a few clicks of a mouse, a legal cage had been lowered over the house on Hemlock Lane. It was invisible, intangible, but utterly inescapable. From that moment on, the official public record showed that the title to the property was in dispute. My brother was now the proud owner of a legal landmine. With the legal trap set, I had to complete the second part of the plan, my departure. I needed to be seen leaving, to fully comply with the eviction, to ensure they had no inkling of the storm that was about to break. I drove back to the house one last time. The sight of it, standing proud and serene under the afternoon sun, sent a pang of sorrow through me. This part of the plan felt like a betrayal of the house itself. I parked my car and walked through the front door, the key feeling heavy and foreign in my hand. The house was silent, eerily so. Most of my essential belongings were already gone, but the soul of the place remained. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked its steady rhythm. Sunlight streamed through the wavy, imperfect glass of the original windows, casting dancing patterns on the floor. Instead of doing a final sweep for forgotten items, I undertook a different kind of task. I walked through every room with my phone, taking clear, date-stamped photographs. This wasn't just for sentimental reasons, it was for evidence. I documented the state of the house, the repairs I had completed, the care with which it had been maintained. I took pictures of the restored woodwork, the polished floors, the pristine condition of the antique fixtures. This would serve as a baseline, a record of the state of the property when it left my care. It was the final page of my curatorial record. My last stop was the study. I ran my hand over the worn leather armchair where I had spent so many nights reading. I looked at the empty shelves where my research books had been. This room had been my sanctuary, the intellectual heart of my life. Leaving it felt like an amputation. My 12 hours were nearly up. I walked into the kitchen and placed the front door key on the granite countertop, a stark symbol of my surrender. As my fingers let go of the cold metal, a profound sense of finality washed over me. I was a guest here now, a trespasser. I took one last look around, memorizing the way the light fell across the dining room table where my world had been shattered just a day before. I didn't feel defeated anymore. Instead, I felt a quiet, steely resolve. I was relinquishing a key, but I was holding an ace. They had won the battle for the building, but I had already launched the war for its soul. I walked out the front door and without looking back pulled it shut. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet street. I got in my car and drove away, my mind calm and clear. The quiet transfer was complete. I had handed them the house, a beautiful, historic, and now legally worthless prize. The next move was theirs, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that they were about to walk directly into the trap I had so carefully and so quietly set. The silence was about to be broken, not by me, but by the frantic, panicked calls of their lawyers and bankers. And I was content to wait for the show to begin. Leo took possession of the house on Hemlock Lane with all the subtlety of a conquering king. He sent me a single, smug text message at 10:05 p.m., 5 minutes after my deadline had officially passed. Keys received. A new era has begun. I didn't reply. I imagined him walking through the empty rooms, not with a sense of history or belonging, but with the cold calculation of an investor surveying a new acquisition. To him, the house was not a home. It was a stepping stone, a silent partner in his next big venture. For the next few days, I heard nothing. I stayed with Isabel, trying to build a new routine, pushing away the phantom limb of a home I had lost. We monitored the county records online, waiting for any sign that the Lees pendants had been discovered. For 72 hours, there was nothing but silence. It was the calm before the storm. The storm broke on a Friday afternoon. Leo, according to the timeline we pieced together later, had spent the week meeting with his financial backers. He was on an aggressive schedule, promising his investors that he would have the first round of capital secured by the end of the month. The house was the linchpin of his entire plan. That Friday, he formally submitted the application for a multi-million-dollar line of credit to a private investment bank, using the deed to the house, now legally in his name, as the sole collateral. The bank's legal department was efficient. A title search, a routine part of any major property transaction, was initiated immediately. It didn't take them long to find the red flag. A junior analyst, likely just doing their due diligence, would have seen the notice of Lee's pendants attached to the property's file. In the staid, risk-averse world of banking, a clouded title is the equivalent of a quarantine notice. It signals uncertainty, litigation, and potential loss. At 3:45 p.m. that afternoon, Leo received a call. It wasn't the congratulatory call he was expecting, confirming his line of credit. It was a curt, formal call from the bank's senior loan officer. The officer informed him that his application was being suspended indefinitely. The reason given was a significant encumbrance and pending litigation that directly affected the title of the collateral property. The bank, he was told in no uncertain terms, would not and could not extend any credit against a contested asset. Leo's initial reaction was likely disbelief, followed by explosive anger. He probably assumed it was a clerical error, a bureaucratic mix-up. He ended the call and immediately phoned our father, Arthur, his voice a frantic torrent of indignation and confusion. An encumbrance? Pending litigation? It made no sense. They had the deed. The transfer was clean. Arthur, a man who believed any problem could be solved by applying enough pressure and money, was furious. He assured Leo he would handle it. He got on the phone with his high-powered corporate lawyer, a man accustomed to dealing with mergers and acquisitions, not dusty property disputes. Arthur demanded the lawyer clear up this ridiculous mistake immediately. The lawyer, a sharp operator named Mr. Davies, promised to look into it. He accessed the county records from his downtown office. Within minutes, he saw what the bank had seen. He saw the notice of Lee's pendants. He saw the case number. And he saw the names on the petition, Clara as the plaintiff and Isabel's reputable law firm as her counsel. Davies then did what any good lawyer would do. He pulled the full petition. He would have read through the entire document, his initial annoyance likely turning to grudging admiration. He would have seen the covenant, the historical evidence, Leo's own investment prospectus attached as an exhibit. He would have recognized the airtight logic of the argument, the way Isabel had perfectly woven a century-old document into a modern legal framework. This was no clerical error. This was a sophisticated, deeply researched, and exquisitely executed legal maneuver. The phone call Mr. Davies made back to my father was, by all accounts, a grim one. He would have explained in cold, legal terms the nature of the covenant. He would have told Arthur that while it was archaic, it appeared to be entirely valid. He would have explained that Clara's standing as a plaintiff was exceptionally strong, given her profession and documented history of maintaining the property. He would have laid out the brutal reality. To clear the title, they would have to fight the lawsuit. A fight that would be incredibly expensive, very public, and, in his professional opinion, one they were very likely to lose. The keys to the kingdom, the grand house on Hemlock Lane, were suddenly worthless. It was a paper asset, a financial mirage. They owned a multi-million-dollar property that they couldn't sell, couldn't borrow against, and couldn't develop. They were trapped. They were legally obligated to pay the hefty property taxes and maintain the grounds, but they could reap none of the financial benefits they had planned. The house had become a prison, its beautiful, historic walls a monument to their own greed and arrogance. I can only imagine the scene that evening. My father and brother, together in the grand living room of the house, the silence thick with the weight of their catastrophic miscalculation. The triumphant phone calls they had planned to make were replaced by panicked arguments. The elation of their victory had evaporated, leaving behind the bitter taste of defeat. They had slammed the door on me, believing they were securing their prize, but all they had done was lock themselves inside with their mistake. The kingdom was theirs, but the keys were useless, and the walls were closing in. The fallout from their discovery was not immediate. My father was a proud, stubborn man, and his first instinct was ways to fight, to dominate, to bully his way to a win. For 2 weeks, a tense silence descended. Isabel and I knew they were scrambling, getting second and third legal opinions, searching desperately for a loophole, a weakness in our case. But my great-grandfather's words, fortified by Isabel's legal acumen, held strong. The walls of our fortress were unbreachable. The first crack in their resolve appeared in the form of a letter from Mr. Davies to Isabel. It was a blustering, aggressive piece of legal correspondence, full of threats of countersuits for frivolous litigation and tortious interference. It accused me of acting out of spite and malice. Isabel read it, laughed, and dictated a calm, 2-sentence reply that essentially said, "We are confident in our position. See you in court." The real sign of their desperation came a week later. My phone rang, displaying my father's name for the first time in nearly a month. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was a rambling, angry tirade, demanding I call him back, ordering me to stop this foolishness and be reasonable. The tone was that of a king whose command had been ignored, a mix of fury and disbelief. I deleted the message without a second thought. The final, decisive blow was financial. Leo's investment fund, which was entirely dependent on the house as collateral, began to collapse. His high-profile investors, spooked by the delay and the rumors of a messy legal battle, started pulling out. The lucrative deal he had boasted about at that last Sunday dinner was disintegrating before his eyes. The pressure mounted, not just from his investors, but from the massive legal bills they were incurring simply by having their lawyers research the case. They were hemorrhaging money, all for a house they couldn't use. Finally, the call I had been waiting for came. It was my father again, but this time, his voice was different. The bluster was gone, replaced by a weary, hollow tone. The king had been deposed. "Clara," he began without any preamble, "what do you want?" It was the first time he had asked me that question in my entire life. "I want you to talk to my lawyer," I said, my voice cool and even. "Her name is Isabel. You should have her number." I hung up before he could respond. The negotiation, if it could be called that, was swift and brutal. Isabel fielded the call from a much humbled Mr. Davies. She laid out my terms. They were simple, absolute, and non-negotiable. First, they would immediately sign over the full, uncontested deed to the house on Hemlock Lane to me. I would be the sole owner, free and clear of any claims. Second, they would reimburse me for all my legal fees. And third, I required a formal written apology from both my father and my brother. The letter had to acknowledge the emotional and financial distress their actions had caused and explicitly recognize my lifelong dedication to preserving our family's history. It was not for public dissemination. It was for me. It was the pound of flesh the emotional part of me still needed. They balked at the apology. To them, it was the ultimate humiliation, a formal admission of wrongdoing that their egos could barely stomach. But they were cornered. Every day they delayed, Leo's professional reputation crumbled a little more, and the legal bills grew higher. After a tense 48-hour standoff, they capitulated. A week later, I sat with Isabel in her office. In front of me were two documents. The first was the new deed to the house on Hemlock Lane, with my name, Clara, printed in clear, bold type. The second was the letter. It was stilted and obviously written through gritted teeth, but the required words were there. I folded it once and put it away. I knew I would likely never read it again. Its purpose was served. Returning to the house was a surreal experience. I walked through the front door not as a tenant, not as a custodian, but as its rightful owner and protector. The air felt different, lighter. The silence was no longer eerie, it was peaceful. I stood in the dining room and placed my hand on the great oak table. It was no longer a site of trauma, but a symbol of my victory. My relationship with my father and brother is shattered, likely beyond repair. The apologies were legal instruments, not heartfelt reckonings. But in losing them, I found something far more valuable: my own strength, a validation of my life's work on my own terms. My first act as the owner was not to change the locks, but to begin a new project. I sat down at the desk in my study and began drafting the application to have the Hemlock Lane estate placed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a long, arduous process, but when it's complete, the house will be protected forever, its story and its legacy safe from the whims of markets and the greed of men. I had not only reclaimed my home, I had secured its future. The foundation my great-grandfather laid was solid, and I, his descendant, had proven myself worthy of rebuilding upon it.